Chapter 2. Captured. In the dream, Guy was still in the lane. He was trying to run, but the mud was so thick that it clung to his boots like porridge, and he could not lift his feet. The soldiers were charging down on him in their red tunics and huge spurred boots. He could not escape. The brown-faced corporal rode in front, grinning like a demon, and waving a rope with a noose in the end. Loud and exultant, his hoarse voice bawled, "Here's your hemp collar, Guy Sands, if you please." Frantic, Guy wallowed on through the mire and potholes, but it was no use. The horseman caught up with him, and the corporal leaned from his saddle to cast the noose over his head. Guy tried to scream, but his voice would not come. All he could get out was a low, mournful groan. He awoke, cold and sweating with fear. It was pitch dark in the shed. Lying in the piled straw, he grew calmer. The nightmare had been so real and vivid that he shook all over, and the sound of the groan was still in his ears. He was just dozing off a second time when he heard it again. At once he was wide awake. It seemed as if his chest was clamped in hoops of iron. He could not get his breath, and felt his limbs jerk helplessly. In all his life he had never been so frightened. Guy was a boy of his time. In those days nearly everyone believed in ghosts and witches. For all that, he had a stubborn will, and was no coward. At home, in the border village where he was born, he had won several fights against bigger boys, because he would not give in when he was getting the worst of it. And often he had to fight because he would not run, even when he was scared and his knees were like water. His fear at those times was nothing to what he felt now. A bigger boy might be a hard nut to crack, but at least he was a real and solid. At worst, one only got a good hiding, and if lucky, managed to land a good thwack or two in payment for it. But a thing which moaned eerily in a deserted shed was a very different matter. Close as an animal in his nest of straw, he held his limbs stiff to keep them from shaking. With all his might he listened, hoping that the sound would turn out to be only another part of the nightmare, but miserably certain that it was not. Outside the wind had risen again, and whimpered round the shed. It wailed softly in uneven gusts, and fumbled at the door like some lost blind thing trying to get in. Perhaps it had been the wind, he told himself. Even while he fought desperately to make himself believe this, there was a rustle in the straw near him, and the horrid noise reached his ears once again. This time there was no mistake. Low and mournful, it throbbed through the black velvet of the night with an unearthly anguish that chilled his blood. Quietly, he sat up in the straw. He had no weapon to defend himself. What if it crouched there, ready to jump on him? Somehow he screwed his nerve to throw out a challenge. His voice was a croaking whisper. "Who's there?" There was no reply. He was ready to bolt for the door when it began again. This time it began to mumble, as if to itself. Guy checked himself, on the point of running, and a sigh of utter relief burst from him. At last he knew the sound was human. More confidently he called again. Whatever peril might be there, it was no ghostly menace, but something which at least belonged to this world. A faint answer came from the dark. It spoke weakly, in a tongue he could not understand. His fright left him altogether, for the voice was a man's, wretched and suffering. Guy stood up. He would need light, and remembered the old lantern by the door. He groped through the murk, fingers creeping along the wall, until he found it. It took several attempts with his tinderbox before he could strike a light, for the punk was damp, and the sparks would not ignite it. At last he got the candle burning inside the lamp. He raised it high and looked about him. A scant yard from where he had been lying, 2 men were sprawled in the straw. At sight of them he nearly dropped the lantern. Both were caked with blood and dirt, wrapped in foul tatters of plaid shawls, which were kilted around their waists. They had no shoes, and their naked legs were blue with cold. Flakes of straw clung to their matted beards and tangled hair, adding to the barbarity of their looks. They must have been already in the shed when he came in, but were too exhausted and sick to notice. As he stared, one of them crawled to his knees and muttered crazily as he blinked in the light. Guy could not understand what he said. The other man was stretched out limply, with his eyes closed. It was he who had groaned. Sickened, Guy realised that both were badly wounded and needed help, urgently. He wondered what to do. Then the kneeling man addressed him again, and Guy understood that he was speaking English. "Water," he whispered. "Give water, Mamik." A great broadsword lay beneath his hand, but he made no offer to lift it. Guy sensed that he was not unfriendly, only ill and in need of attention. The dragoon's warning about aiding the king's enemies never came to mind. Going outside, Guy left the door open while he fetched water from the ditch in his hat. This was the mistake which cost all 3 of them dearly. He had just brought the water back into the shed and was giving it to the Highlander, when he remembered the door and went back and closed it. The Highlander reached for the dripping hat and gulped the liquid fiercely, but checked after a couple of swallows. Bending over his companion, he loosed a few drops through the slack lips. The prostrate man did not open his eyes. The Highlander looked up with Guy's hat in his hands and shook his bedraggled red head. "Poor Dugald," he whispered. "He'll march no more, I'm thinking." Guy knelt by him and examined the wretched Dugald, who was plainly far gone. A blue hole punctured his chest, and there was another wound in his arm. His chest bled little, but the arm lay in a puddle of sickening red. Guy tore a piece off his own shirt for a bandage, as neither of the rebels owned such a garment. So far as he could see, they had nothing at all except their plaids and weapons. The wind cried louder now, rattling loose boards in the roof and soughing through the gorse. Once Guy thought he heard a movement outside, but it did not come again, and he was too absorbed in what he was doing to take much heed. He had just tied the linen round Dugald's arm when the door crashed open. A brazen yell sounded. "Hold! In the king's name!" Dumbfounded, Guy knew the voice. The corporal was in the hut, lunging forward. The troopers swarmed on his heels. At the dragoon's shout, the Highlander sprang to his feet with the great sword clasped in both his hands. He staggered as he lifted it. Before he could whirl it in its mighty sweep, he went down under a press of bodies, fighting like a wild cat. "Take 'em alive, lads!" The corporal's bawl rose above the tumult. "There's a bounty on the vermin. We'll drink their health in spiced ale when we get back to quarters." 2 more flung themselves on the prostrate Dugald to tie his arms with cords. Guy was furious at this senseless brutality. Dugald was beyond hurting anybody, and the sight of this cruel treatment made Guy flare up in a wild rage. He jumped on the back of the nearest soldier and dragged him away. "Let be, you coward!" he stormed. "Can you not see the poor wretch is near death?" The dragoon jumped up and threw him off. "Ye young dog, I'll learn ye to interfere with a soldier in his duty." A rough hand seized Guy by the collar and shook him until his teeth rattled. Dimly he heard the corporal chuckling harshly. "Why, if it ain't Master Guy Sands! So, you was a confounded Jack after all." Before he could answer, he was flung on his face in the straw, and the trooper who held him dragged his wrists behind his back to lash them tight with a piece of cord. "There, me young spitfire," he snarled. "P'raps that'll keep you out of mischief for a while." Guy appealed to the corporal as soon as he could speak. "Sir, these men are wounded. Must they be so mistreated? Rebels or no, they are too weak to do any harm." "Only time as you Jacobites do no harm is when you're safe in irons," was the reply. "I've seen enough of Highlandmen to know they're dangerous as long as they can draw breath, and that'll be no long time for the 3 of ye, my lad." For the first time Guy awoke to his own danger. Until now he had been too angry at the manhandling of the wounded men to think of himself. "I'm no rebel, as I told you before," he exclaimed. "I did no more and no less than becomes any decent person. They were sore hurt, and I gave them what help I could." The dragoon sucked his yellow teeth. "I warned ye about aiding the king's foes," he rasped. "But it seems that, even if ye're not one of 'em, ye was willing to help 'em. Howsomever, ye can cant to the justices about that when you meet 'em. It's all one to me." Ignoring the boy, he glanced around. The other Scot was disarmed and bound, hunkered down against the wall like an animal. His eyes glared, and a new cut loosened a trickle of blood down his forehead. "Saisnig pigs," he spat through his bristling beard. "You would murder poor Dugald, and him at his last breath." "Hold your row, Sawney," rapped the corporal off-handedly. "You can save all that for the beak, same as I told the nipper here. Come to that, I dare say your pal Dougal has nicked a thrapple or 2 in his time himself. Besides, he ain't dead yet." He turned to Guy with his sneering grin. "This is a good pitch, sonny. It was right handsome in you for opening the door and showing us a glim. Hadn't been for that, we'd have ridden on without finding you." Guy said nothing. It was just bad luck. But if only he had lit the lantern when he first thought of it, he thought. If he had, none of this would have happened. The corporal gave brisk orders to the troopers. "Picket the osses beside the shed, out of the wind, and we'll bivvy here for the night. Jones, you and Breakspear on sentry outside for the first 2 hours. Margit and Crumb take next. Anybody got anything to eat?" The tired cavalrymen tended their mounts, and then came in to sprawl around the shed. From their saddle rolls they brought out what food they had, hard biscuit and cheese, and eggs, and bottled ale they had looted from some hamlet during their patrol. Duly, Guy watched the meat. He forgot how ravenously hungry he was himself, as he thought of his future. It looked black.